The first thing Captain Elias Ward noticed about the throne room was that it wasn't built for comfort. It was built for endurance. The chamber stretched like a cathedral carved from a single piece of obsidian crystal, its walls rising into darkness, where faint bands of bioluminescent light pulsed like slow, alien heartbeats. The floor was a mosaic of star metal plates, each etched with symbols that looked less like writing and more like the frozen echoes of sound. The air was thin, sharp with the scent of ozone and something faintly metallic, like blood remembered by stone. At the far end of the hall, on a dais shaped like interlocking blades, lay the queen of the Caraxian Concord. She was dying. Elias had seen a lot of wounded beings in his years with the Terran Coalition Navy, humans since a dozen allied species, but nothing quite like this. The Caraxians were tall, elegant creatures, all long limbs and layered, iridescent chitin that shifted color with mood and light. Their queen was larger than any of the soldiers who flanked the walls, her segmented crown rising like a living crest from her skull. Normally, she would have been a vision of terrifying grace. Now, she was slumped against her throne, one arm hanging uselessly at her side. Dark, shimmering blood pooled beneath her, spreading in slow, viscous patterns across the star metal floor. And yet, when Elias took a cautious step forward, her eyes opened. They were not the faceted, insect-like orbs he had expected. They were deep, luminous, and painfully aware. They locked onto him. "Human," she said, her voice echoing not just in the air, but in his skull, resonant and layered like a chorus forced into a single throat. "You came." Elias swallowed. "Your Majesty. You sent for me." Around him, Caraxian guards shifted, their spear-like weapons humming with restrained energy. None of them looked happy about a human standing this close to their ruler. And frankly, Elias didn't blame them. The Concord and humanity were allies, yes, but uneasy ones. Too many wars in too many star systems had taught everyone that alliances were just pauses between disasters. Still, when a queen called, you answered. Especially when she called in secret. "You are injured," Elias said carefully. "We can get you medical support." "My ship has." "No," she interrupted, and this time the word carried a sharp edge that made his teeth ache. "There is no time, and there is no one here I can trust." Her gaze flicked, just for a moment, toward the assembled court. The air in the chamber changed. Elias felt it like a pressure shift before a storm. "You were betrayed," he said. "Yes." The single word was heavy enough to bend gravity. The Caraxian Concord had always been a strange empire. Not cruel, not benevolent, just ancient. They had risen before humanity had even discovered fire, their first starships launched when Earth's oceans were still young. Their society was built on layered loyalties, house to clutch, clutch to spire, spire to throne. It was elegant, rigid, and like all rigid systems, brittle under the right kind of stress. The queen's name was Shakara Vale, and she had ruled for 3 centuries. Under her, the Concord had stabilized its borders, signed the first real treaties with humanity, and pushed back against the predatory ZYRN swarms that had been chewing through the outer arms. She was not supposed to be lying in a pool of her own blood. "The attack came from within," Shakara said, her voice weaker now, but still carrying that strange, layered power. "My first voice. My most trusted blade. He opened my guard. He struck while the court watched and did nothing." Elias frowned. "Why?" "Because he has promised them a future without me," she replied. "A future where the Concord kneels to fear and calls it survival." That sounded uncomfortably familiar. Elias had seen that argument on Earth more times than he cared to remember. "And you called me because," he prompted. Shakara's eyes narrowed, focusing on him with unsettling intensity. Because you are outside our chains, she said. Because your kind is difficult to predict. And because I have seen what humans do when they decide something must not be allowed to end. The words landed heavier than she probably intended. Elias thought of burning colonies, of evacuation fleets, of medics working themselves to death to save one more person. He thought of soldiers holding lines they had no right to survive. Flattery aside, he said quietly, "What do you need from me?" Her clawed hand twitched, then lifted, just barely, and reached toward him.
"Carry my will," she said.
"And if you must carry my end." They didn't have long. Even Elias could see that. The wound in Shakira's thorax wasn't just physical. It shimmered with a sickly, disruptive energy that screamed of some kind of anti-regenerative weapon. Caraxians healed quickly. Their queen wasn't healing at all. "This blade was made to kill me slowly," she said, as if reading his thoughts, "so that my court could argue while I faded." "Charming people," Elias muttered. A weak, almost amused pulse of color rippled across her chitin. "You have a talent for understatement, human." She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again, sharper now, more focused. "There is a data core beneath this throne," she said. "It contains proof of the betrayal. Names. Agreements. The full rot. If it reaches the right spires, the Concord can still be saved." "And you want me to take it?" Elias said. "Yes. And that'll paint a pretty big target on my back," he added. "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "Figures." One of the guards took a step forward, weapon rising. "Your Majesty, this is madness. A human cannot be trusted with." Shakira's gaze snapped to him, and the room seemed to shudder. "He can," she said. "Because if he betrays me, he loses nothing. If you betray me, you gain everything. That is the difference." The guard froze, then slowly stepped back. Elias rubbed his face. "You're really good at making a man feel special in the worst possible way, you know that?" Another faint ripple of color, this one almost like dry humor.
"Go," she said.
"Before they decide, I am already dead." The alarm started less than 3 minutes later. Elias was halfway down a spiraling corridor when the first shockwave hit, throwing him into a wall hard enough to rattle his teeth. The palace lights flickered, then shifted to a pulsing red that made everything look like it was drowning in blood. "Of course," he groaned, pushing himself up. "Couldn't be easy." His calm crackled. "Captain, we're detecting internal weapons fire across the palace," his XO said. "This is not a drill." "Yeah, I noticed," Elias said, clutching the slim, impossibly dense data core Shakira had given him. "Get the ship ready. We're going to have company." They came fast. Caraxian enforcers poured into the corridors, their movements precise, coordinated, and very clearly aimed at one human running in the wrong direction. Energy lances burned holes through walls just behind him as Elias Dove rolled and swore creatively. He wasn't supposed to win this. He knew that. But humans had never been very good at sticking to what they were supposed to do. He ducked into a maintenance shaft, tore open a panel with more strength than finesse, and vanished just as a volley of plasma turned the corridor into molten slag. The shaft was too small for most Caraxians to follow quickly, and he used every second of that advantage, crawling, scrambling, and occasionally sliding in ways that would absolutely destroy his uniform. "Captain," his XO said again, voice tight. "We've got hostile Caraxian ships launching. They're not even pretending anymore." "Good," Elias said. "Means we're doing something right." He burst out of the shaft into a hangar that was already half on fire. His ship, the Resolute, sat at the far end, her crew scrambling aboard under cover fire from their own turrets. Elias ran. Something slammed into his side, spinning him off his feet. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he kept moving, rolling, coming up with his sidearm already firing. The shots didn't do much more than annoy the Caraxian enforcer charging him, but annoyance was enough to buy time. Time was all he ever really needed. He made it up the ramp just as it started to close. The Resolute lifted off under fire, her shields flaring bright white as they took hit after hit. "Punch it," Elias said, breathless. The stars stretched, and then they were gone. Shakera did not die that day, but she came very close. The Concorde announced her passing within the hour, and the palace broadcasts were filled with solemn declarations and very carefully worded promises of continuity. The first voice, now calling himself regent, stood before the spires and spoke of unity, of stability, of necessary change. Elias watched it all from a safe distance, jaw tight. "People back home won't like this," his XO said quietly. "No," Elias agreed. "But they'll like what comes next even less if we don't do something." The data core was worse than he'd expected. Not just names, not just plans. It was a full blueprint for turning the Concorde into a fortress state, cutting ties with its allies and preemptively striking anyone who might one day become a threat, including humanity. They were going to start a war, his XO said.
"They already did," Elias replied.
"They just used a knife instead of a fleet."
For days they ran,
hiding, jumping, feeding pieces of the truth to the right channels while dodging Concorde patrols that were suddenly very eager to find one specific human ship. And all the while, Elias couldn't shake the memory of Shakera's eyes. The way she had looked at him. Not like a savior, like a last, ugly hope. The message came a week later, encoded in a way that made his comms officer swear and then laugh in disbelief. "She's alive," the officer said.
"Barely.
"And she wants to meet." Elias didn't hesitate. Plot the course. They found her not on a throne, but in a hidden sanctuary grown into the heart of an asteroid, a place of living crystal and soft, shifting light. Shakera lay in a cradle of bioluminescent vines, thinner, dimmer, but very much alive. When she saw him, her colors shifted in something that might have been relief.
"You made it out," she said.
"Hard to get rid of me," Elias replied. "Your regent, though? He's making a mess of things." "Yes," she said softly, as he always would. He stepped closer. "The Concorde's on the edge of civil war. Your proof is spreading. The spires are choosing sides." "And you?" she asked. "I'm a human captain with a very annoyed government and a ship that's burned a lot of bridges," he said. "So, pretty much business as usual." For a moment, they just looked at each other. Two leaders from two very different species, connected by one very messy act of trust. "You should have let me die," she said quietly. Elias shook his head.
"Yeah.
Humans aren't great at that." A faint, warm glow rippled across her chitin. "That," she said, "is why I chose you." The war that followed was short, brutal, and strangely restrained. The Concorde fractured, but it didn't collapse. The Regent's faction tried to move fast, to seize key systems before the opposition could organize, but they hadn't counted on how much of the fleet still remembered Shakera's rule, or how much damage a single, very loud human task force could do when it decided to make a point. Elias found himself in more battles in 3 months than he'd seen in 3 years. But slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. The Regent fell, not to a blade in the dark, but to a public trial and a firing squad he couldn't talk his way out of. When it was over, the Concorde was changed. So was humanity's place in it. Elias stood in the rebuilt throne room months later, looking up at a throne that had been reshaped, not into something softer, but into something stronger. Shakera stood before him, no longer supported by vines, her colors bright and steady. "You could have taken advantage of our weakness," she said. "Your kind has done so before in other ages, in other empires." "Yeah," Elias said. "We've also learned how that usually ends." She studied him for a long moment. "Humans are strange," she said finally. "You are fragile, short-lived, and yet you throw yourselves into storms that should tear you apart." He shrugged. "Guess we're stubborn." Her eyes softened. "You did not flinch," she said. "Not when my court turned. Not when my fleets hunted you. Not when my empire teetered." "Flinching's overrated," Elias replied. She extended her hand, carefully, deliberately. "Then let us build something that will not require such courage quite so often," she said. Elias took it, and for the first time since he'd run through a burning palace with a dead empire in his pocket, he felt like maybe, just maybe, the galaxy had learned something from a human who refused to walk away. The rebuilt throne room was quieter than Elias expected. Not empty, never empty, but quiet in the way only places that had survived catastrophe could be. The walls still carried faint scars where plasma had burned through living crystal. Some of the bioluminescent veins in the architecture glowed a slightly different color, where new growth had been forced to replace what had died. The Caraxians did not erase their wounds. They incorporated them. Elias stood at the center of it all, hands clasped behind his back, wearing a uniform that had been cleaned but never quite lost the marks of too many battles. Around him, the Spire's delegates formed a wide, cautious circle, warriors, diplomats, and strategists who had once been enemies and now had to pretend they weren't. At the far end, Shakera Vale ascended the steps to her throne. She moved more slowly than she once had. The injury she'd taken would never fully disappear, and everyone in the chamber knew it. But she stood on her own, her colors strong and steady, her presence still heavy enough to bend the mood of the room around her. When she turned to face them, the murmur died instantly. 3 cycles ago, she said, her voice echoing across the chamber, this concord stood on the edge of self-inflicted extinction. Not because our enemies were stronger, but because we chose fear over memory and ambition over duty. Her gaze swept across the assembled spires. "I was betrayed," she continued, "not by an outsider, not by a rival empire, but by my own first voice, by those who believed control was the same thing as survival." Some of the delegates shifted uncomfortably. Others held her gaze, without flinching. "And I lived," she said, "because someone who owed us nothing refused to let us end ourselves in silence." She turned toward Elias. Every eye in the chamber followed. "The human Captain Elias Ward carried our truth through fire, through pursuit, and through the collapse of trust itself," Shakera said. "He could have sold it. He could have used it. He could have walked away and let us burn." Elias felt suddenly very aware of how many weapons were in the room. "He did none of those things," she finished. "He chose stability over profit, truth over safety, and action over comfort." She paused, then added more quietly, "He chose us." The chamber remained silent for a long moment. Then, one by one, the Spire delegates lowered their heads. Not in submission, in acknowledgement. Elias exhaled slowly, tension he hadn't realized he was carrying finally loosening in his chest. Later, away from the formalities and the watching eyes, Elias stood on a balcony overlooking the capital Spire's inner light wells. The city was rebuilding, ships moving in careful patterns, construction swarms knitting new structures into old bones, life continuing with stubborn, infuriating persistence. Shakera joined him, the soft sound of her steps barely audible on the crystal floor. "You could have stayed away," she said. "You could have sent the data and let us tear ourselves apart without you." "Yeah," Elias said. "Humans are bad at that part. She studied him. Your kind intervenes in broken systems even when it costs you, even when there is no guarantee of gratitude. He gave a small, tired smile. We've learned what happens when nobody does. For a while, they just watched the city. Your governments will want influence, she said eventually. Trade. Security guarantees. A stronger voice in Concord space. They already do, Elias replied. And yours will want distance.
Time.
Proof we're not here to run your empire for you. She inclined her head. You understand politics better than you pretend. Occupational hazard, he said. She turned to face him fully. I will not offer you empty thanks, Captain Ward. The Concord will remember what you did. But more than that, we will remember why you did it. And what's that? He asked. Because you saw a system failing, she said. And you chose to hold it together long enough for it to heal, rather than let it collapse for your convenience. Elias looked back out at the city. Someone once did that for us. Long time ago. Figured it was our turn. The Resolute departed Caraxian space 3 days later. There were no parades. No grand announcements. Just a quiet, formal escort to the edge of Concord territory and a brief, respectful exchange of signals before the stars stretched into lines and the ship slipped into jump. On the bridge, Elias sat in his chair, hands resting lightly on the armrests. Well, his XO said, we didn't start a war, we didn't end an empire, and we didn't get arrested. High success rate, Elias replied. Set course for home. As the ship turned, the comm panel lit up one last time. A simple message. From Shakera. The Concord stands. Not because it is unbreakable, but because when it broke, someone refused to let it stay that way. Elias stared at it for a moment, then nodded to himself. Yeah, he said quietly. That sounds about right. The Resolute jumped. And somewhere behind them, an ancient empire kept rebuilding, not because it was perfect, not because it was strong enough to stand alone, but because, when it was betrayed and bleeding, a human had not flinched.